At 5 in the morning, on a freezing November night in Stirling, Scotland, two neighbors were ripped from their sleep. It wasn't just a knock, it was frantic, desperate banging on their front door. When they opened it, they found a man standing in the dark. He was heavily intoxicated, swaying, barely able to form a coherent sentence, but the words he did manage to choke out were clear enough. "Wake up, I think I'm the reason she's gone." What those neighbors found inside the flat next door is something that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. A young woman, a mother to a little boy, lying on her bedroom floor. She had sustained such severe physical trauma, she was nearly unrecognizable. The scene was so extensive, so devastating, that even the first responders, people trained to handle the worst, struggled to process what they were looking at. She was 28 years old. Her name was Claire Inglis. And the man standing at that door, he was her boyfriend, the one person she was supposed to trust more than anyone else in the world. Now, in most true crime stories, the mystery is who is responsible. But here, the perpetrator's identity is straightforward. We know exactly who did it. The real mystery, the terrifying question that hangs over this entire case, is why was he even there? Because the most horrifying part of Claire Inglis's story isn't just how she lost her life, it's the fact that the man who took her away never should have been in that flat to begin with. The people whose job it was to protect her, they knew exactly who he was, and they let it happen anyway. This is the heartbreaking story of Claire Inglis. Claire Inglis was born in 1993 in Stirling, Scotland. She was raised in a deeply loving home by her parents, Ian and Fiona. She loved the color pink. She was obsessed with Disney, and she had this natural, effortless gentleness with children. In fact, it shaped her entire life. She trained as a childminder, and for Claire, it wasn't just a paycheck, it was a calling. In June 2014, at just 21 years old, Claire became a mother herself. She gave birth to a baby boy, and she was absolutely smitten. Motherhood quickly became the center of her universe. Getting him to school, picking him up, making sure he had every little thing he needed. He was her entire world. But life had already dealt Claire a devastating blow. In 2017, when her son was only 3 years old, his father lost his life in a tragic car accident. Just like that. At 24 years old, Claire was a single mother. She was raising a toddler entirely on her own, while deeply grieving the sudden loss of the man she'd built a family with. It is the kind of tragedy that would break most people. It would make them bitter, angry at the world, but not Claire. She didn't let the grief destroy her. Friends described her as a beautiful, incredible young mom who selflessly gave her time to everyone around her. She took all that pain, and she just poured it into loving her son. By 2019, 2 years after that profound loss, Claire finally felt ready to open her heart again. She was lonely. She wanted companionship. She wanted her son to have a stable home, and maybe a father figure. And after everything she'd been through, who could possibly blame her for wanting a little bit of happiness? She was looking for a fresh start, but instead, she found Christopher McGowan. To understand what happened to Claire, you have to understand the absolute monster she led into her life. Christopher McGowan. His criminal record began when he was just 14 years old. He was charged with a breach of the peace, and from that point forward, he never stopped. Over the next 14 years, McGowan racked up an astonishing 39 convictions. And we are not talking about minor infractions here. Assault, robbery, distributing illegal substances, dangerous driving, shoplifting, criminal damage. In one particularly terrifying incident in April 2020, he threatened a police officer with a large bladed weapon. That earned him a 21-month prison sentence. But here is the detail that becomes critically, terrifyingly important later. Among those 39 convictions were at least 3 separate assault charges. And one of those charges, dating back to 2014, was explicitly described in the police system as having a domestic element. He had harmed an intimate partner before. It was documented. The authorities knew exactly what he was capable of doing to a woman. Locals around Stirling knew him by the nickname Kiki. He had a prominent scar on his face, a chaotic history of abusing alcohol and prescription medication, and a well-known reputation as a highly aggressive troublemaker. He was the kind of person locals literally crossed the street to avoid. This was not a man who made one bad choice in his youth. This was a man who made the same violent choices over and over and over again for 14 years. He showed absolutely zero indication that he had any interest in stopping. And this is the man who walked into Claire Inglis's life. The way Claire and Christopher met wasn't some fairy tale encounter. McGowan was actually the cousin of a man Claire had previously dated. That's how he knew who she was. One day, while Claire was simply walking down a street in Sterling, McGowan shouted at her from across the road. And you know what Claire's immediate reaction was? Her gut instinct? She wanted to get away from him as fast as possible. Her intuition screamed that this was a bad man. Her mother, Fiona, shared that exact same instinct. She had heard McGowan's name around town. She knew his history of aggression. In fact, she bluntly warned Claire that he was nothing but a street thug. And yet, within just 2 weeks of that encounter on the street, Claire was in a relationship with him. 2 weeks, from wanting to run away from him to dating him. From the outside, it's easy to wonder why she didn't run. If she knew he was bad, why did she stay? But manipulators like McGowan, they don't show you their true face on day one. They use a very specific, well-documented psychological trap. It's called love bombing. A manipulator will flood their target with intense attention, extreme affection, and overwhelming charm in the very early stages. The goal: create a deep emotional bond, fast, before the target's defenses can kick in, and before friends and family can intervene. By the time the mask finally slips, the person is already emotionally invested, and leaving suddenly feels impossible. When Claire called her mother to tell her about the relationship, she opened the conversation with a warning. She said, "You're going to be really upset." She knew. On some level, Claire understood her family would not approve, but by then, the hook was already set. On October 3rd, 2021, Claire updated her Facebook status to "in a relationship." Friends and family were absolutely stunned. People who knew them both described the pairing as chalk and cheese. Two people who couldn't have been more fundamentally different, light and dark. When her parents voiced their concerns, and they voiced them strongly, Claire dismissed them. She called them drama queens. She insisted that Christopher was a good man deep down, that he would change, that she, with her big heart and her gentle nature, could be the one to finally help him turn his troubled life around. Her family tried to stop it. They really did. But at a certain point, when someone is trapped in that psychological cycle, there is nothing more you can do. Her parents had to step back and just pray that Claire would come to her own realization before it was too late. They just didn't know how little time she had left. While Claire and Christopher's relationship was still developing, McGowan found himself exactly where he belonged. Behind bars. He had been remanded in custody after leading the police on a high-speed chase. Given his massive 39 conviction record, he was looking at a significant stretch inside. But Claire, she visited him, faithfully, regularly. She honestly believed this could be a turning point. She thought that maybe this time, sitting in a cold cell, he would finally decide to change his ways. And then, something happened. Something that McGowan seized upon as the ultimate manipulation tactic. While he was incarcerated, his mother passed away. Now it was a genuinely painful loss. But when McGowan spoke to social workers about it, he played them perfectly. He told them this tragedy was the wake-up call he needed. He claimed he was completely done with his old life. No more alcohol, no more prescription medication. He painted a beautiful, convincing picture of a man on the absolute brink of transformation. He even used Claire, claiming their relationship was his motivation to stay clean. While in custody, he appeared in court via video link. He claimed he was desperate to be released, insisting he couldn't bear the thought of attending his mother's funeral in handcuffs. And the justice system bought it. A social worker's assessment actually highlighted his challenging upbringing and unbelievably characterized most of his past offenses as low-level. Based on this report, McGowan was granted bail. But in Scotland, when someone is granted bail, they have to be bailed to a specific address. McGowan was bailed directly to Claire's address, the flat where she lived with her son. I want you to really let that sink in for a second. A man with 39 prior convictions, multiple bail breaches, a history of threatening police with bladed weapons, and a documented domestic charge. The courts took that man and bailed him directly into the home of a young mother and her child. Nobody told Claire that McGowan had a prior domestic conviction against another partner. That information existed in the system. The social workers had access to it. The police knew it. And yet nobody thought to mention it to the young woman whose home this dangerous repeat offender was being released into. The timeline of what happened next is an absolute masterclass in systemic failure. 2 months before the tragedy, social workers had actually raised formal concerns about McGowan living in a household with a child. But when he went to jail in September, they simply closed the case file and shelved those concerns. Just 5 days before Claire lost her life, a justice social worker sent an email to Sterling Council explicitly stating that there were concerns about him living in a household with a child. Just 3 days before the fateful night, social workers visited Claire's flat to check on things. They knocked on the door. Nobody was home, and that was it. They walked away. No follow-up, no phone call, no police welfare check, nothing. 4 of McGowan's 5 bail orders were issued within just 2 months of the final incident. He was being bailed, breaching conditions, being bailed again, breaching again. And every single time, the justice system just kept opening the door and letting him out. Almost immediately after Christopher McGowan moved into Claire's home, the Reformed Man Act vanished. The mask didn't just slip, it was ripped off. He began to dismantle Claire's life, piece by piece. It started with her belongings. McGowan didn't just steal, he did it brazenly. He began selling anything he could get his hands on to fund his dangerous habits. A watch she had received as a special gift for her 21st birthday? Gone. Sold for a fraction of its value. Her young son's gaming console? The one thing that probably brought that little boy joy in a house full of tension? Sold. Anything that could be converted into cash to buy illicit substances went out the door. But even that wasn't enough for him. Claire began accumulating thousands of pounds in debt. McGowan was either aggressively demanding she buy things for him, or he was secretly opening accounts and making purchases in her name. This is what coercive control looks like. It's not always physical. Sometimes it's a total financial ruin. Then came the isolation. Claire's friends and family started receiving text messages from her phone. But they knew Claire. They knew how she spoke. And these messages, they didn't sound like her. The grammar was wrong. The tone was hostile. They realized with growing horror that McGowan had likely taken her phone. He was the one typing. He was the one deciding who Claire could talk to and what she could say. He was cutting her off from the only people who could save her. And behind closed doors, the verbal abuse was reaching a boiling point. We know this because of the witnesses who caught glimpses of their life. A taxi driver later testified about a ride that stayed with him forever. He was driving the couple through Sterling when McGowan suddenly exploded. He threatened to take Claire's life right there, in the back of the car. And do you know what started it? A sandwich. A chip buddy. He confronted her after she refused to buy him a sandwich. That is the level of volatile, senseless rage Claire was living with every single day. Meanwhile, Claire's family was forced to watch this train wreck in slow motion. Ian and Fiona had voiced every objection they had. They had warned her. They had pleaded with her. But they had reached that heartbreaking wall that many families of manipulation targets face. If they pushed too hard, McGowan would use it as an excuse to isolate her even more. So, they had to step back, and Claire's world kept shrinking. Fewer friends, fewer calls, fewer people who could see what was happening behind that locked front door. November 28, 2021, a Sunday. That afternoon, Claire called her mother. She asked for £25, claiming it was for her son. In the final weeks of Claire's life, McGowan was reportedly pressuring her family for money. He repeatedly asked for funds, influencing Claire, who then turned to her mother for help. Fiona, who had been through this exhausting, endless pattern of financial drain for weeks, said no. She then did what she had to do for her own sanity. She turned on Do Not Disturb mode on her phone. Fiona did what any emotionally drained parent would do after months of manipulation. She set a boundary to protect her own peace. Both she and Ian knew what usually followed these requests: a barrage of aggressive, nasty calls and messages, and they strongly suspected those messages were actually being sent by McGowan using Claire's phone. She had absolutely no idea, no way of knowing, that this would be the last time she would ever hear her daughter's voice. Later that evening, Claire and McGowan were spotted out drinking together in the center of Sterling. Now, remember that bail agreement? The one that allowed McGowan to live in Claire's flat? It came with a strict 9 p.m. curfew. He was out in public. He was intoxicated. He was directly violating the conditions of his release. No one stopped him. No one intervened. At some point that night, Claire returned to her flat. A surveillance camera on Bannockburn Road captured her walking into a local shop to buy a few items. The shop owner politely held the door open for her as she left. The footage is grainy, but it's unmistakably Claire, looking small, alone, walking off into the cold, dark night, heading back to a flat where a highly volatile man was waiting. That grainy footage is the last time Claire Inglis was ever captured on camera. What happened inside that flat between the time Claire locked the front door and 5 a.m. the next morning, only Christopher McGowan knows in full, but what the physical evidence tells us is more than enough. When paramedics rushed into the flat following that frantic 5 a.m. call, what they found was a scene that defied description. There were holes punched into the walls. There were unmistakable, devastating signs of a violent struggle reaching every corner of the room. And Claire, lying on the floor of her bedroom, she had sustained catastrophic, extensive trauma to her face and head. The paramedics immediately dropped to the floor and began life-saving measures. In the desperate, frantic process of trying to save her, they discovered a deliberate obstruction in her airway, an object that had been placed there to prevent her from breathing. They fought, and they fought to bring her back, but the trauma was too catastrophic. The injuries were too severe, too numerous. Christopher McGowan, still heavily intoxicated and covered in the physical evidence of the struggle, was arrested and charged in connection with her passing. When the police finally got McGowan into an interrogation room and sobered him up, he had a pathetic little story ready to go. According to him, Claire had accidentally taken a dangerous amount of prescription medication, become wildly disoriented, and simply fallen down the stairs. That, he confidently claimed to the detectives, explained her severe facial injuries. As for the rest of the trauma, he just denied it. Think about the sheer insulting audacity of that lie. A young woman supposedly suffers a severe medical emergency, falls down some stairs, and somehow ends up with dozens upon dozens of distinct injuries across her entire body, with holes punched in the walls, with signs of a struggle reaching the ceiling, with a deliberate obstruction found blocking her airway. The physical evidence inside that flat told a story that was impossible to reconcile with an accidental fall. Everything pointed to one terrifying reality. This was not a sudden accident. This was a prolonged, deliberate, and utterly merciless attack on a young woman who had absolutely no chance of defending herself. And the full, devastating scope of what he did to Claire would soon be laid bare in a courtroom, in testimony so harrowing that it would reduce hardened professionals to silence. An independent expert report was commissioned after the tragedy, and the findings were, in the words of one Scottish politician, truly damning. It found that Claire and her young son had been rendered effectively invisible to the system. No follow-up, no support, no warning. Social workers had flagged concerns. An email had been sent explicitly warning about McGowan living with a child. Someone had visited the flat, knocked on the door, found no one home, and just gave up. Nothing was followed up. No one spoke to Claire. No one told her about McGowan's history of domestic charges. No one offered her support, guidance, or protection. The report identified a major safeguarding lapse. At the center of it is a fundamental, catastrophic flaw in the bail system. Claire's parents have spent years fighting for the full release of that expert report. They refuse to let this go, and they shouldn't have to, Because what happened to Claire was not just the act of one dangerous man, it was the catastrophic end result of a justice system that had every single piece of information it needed to prevent this tragedy, and simply didn't. When the trial of Christopher McGowan finally began at the High Court in Stirling, it lasted over a grueling, heartbreaking week. The judge noted that throughout the entire trial, while looking at the disturbing forensic evidence and hearing what he had done to the woman he supposedly loved, McGowan had shown not a flicker of emotion, not a hint of distress, not a shadow of remorse. The absolute centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the testimony of forensic pathologist Dr. Carrie-Ann Shearer. She was the one who conducted Claire's forensic examination, and when she took the stand and presented her findings, the entire courtroom fell completely silent. Claire had sustained 76 distinct injuries. Both of her eyes showed profound trauma. Extensive contusions covered almost her entire scalp. The pathologist noted specific visual indicators in her eyes, classic, undeniable signs of a severe restriction of breath. There were small, cyclical puncture marks on her cheeks, consistent with a pointed tool. There were thermal injuries from an open flame. And, finally, a massive subdural hemorrhage. Significant internal pressure accumulating beneath her skull from devastating blunt force trauma. The ultimate cause of her passing? The catastrophic head trauma combined with the restriction of breath and the deliberate obstruction of her airway we discussed earlier. This was not a single blow. This was not a sudden, fleeting moment of rage. This attack went on long enough to inflict 76 separate injuries using bare hands, a pointed tool, and an open flame. And what did McGowan's defense team present to counter this overwhelming evidence? Nothing. They offered absolutely no witnesses, no evidence. They relied solely on McGowan's incredibly insulting claim that it was all just some kind of tragic accident. After a week of harrowing testimony, the jury didn't need much time. They deliberated for just 2 hours. Guilty. Unanimous. On October 25, 2023, McGowan stood before Judge Michael O'Grady for sentencing. Under Scottish law, this level of crime carries a mandatory life sentence, but the judge decides the minimum number of years before parole can even be considered. Judge O'Grady sentenced him to a minimum of 23 years. Unbelievably, he later appealed his 23-year sentence. And do you want to know what his argument was? He claimed his sentence was excessive because he hadn't used a conventional weapon like a blade. The appellate court swiftly rejected it. His earliest possible release date is 2046, but given his nature and his complete absence of remorse, there is a very real chance he will spend his final days in a concrete cell.